let's see now the robustness against secondary extinctions in food webs. On the right, we have a plot indicating a classic way of understanding network robustness. On the y-axis, we have the fractions of nodes removed from the web. What is, in our case, the number of species that went primarily extinct. On the y-axis, we have a measure of robustness, and particularly the fragility, which is the inverse of robustness. The higher the fragility, the lower the robustness. This way of measuring robustness is based on a measure of network diameter, that is indicating how much is a network falling apart. The higher a network is losing species, the higher is going to be its diameter. So again, be familiar with this type of graph because it's quite relevant, especially on the y-axis. On the x-axis, where we have the fraction of primary extinctions. The author of this paper used a statistical mechanics approach and simulated two different type of networks, which are represented on the left side of your display. The first one is a random network, and the second one is a scale-free network. The main difference between two networks is mainly the degree distribution, the way that generalist and specialist species are interacting with each other. In random networks, there are few of these generalists and specialists. The roles are more homogeneous, while in scale-free networks, we may remember they follow this scale-free power law distribution, where there are many species with few links and few species with many links. We may also recall that food webs are far from being random, and in particular they resemble this scale-free distribution of the degrees. When we look at on the right side of the display, we can see also that authors employed two types of test of network robustness. Indeed, we can think of many ways a primary extinction can occur. We mentioned before, a primary extinction can occur due to defaunation, habitat destruction, overexploitation due to fishing. As a baseline, we use in ecology a random extinction. This it's important because gives us a way to compare a random scenario from a more plausible scenario of interest. For instance, if we are a policymaker, we may be interested in understanding how the removal of certain species with a specific body mass, or for instance belonging to a specific trophic level, is going to impact the robustness of the food web. So having a random scenario gives us a way to compare. This is what the author of this paper called failure. So let's imagine that the food web, the random, can the network can just randomly lose some species. Some nodes, they fail, they don't work anymore. Some species just randomly they go extinct. And then they compare this with what they call an attack in red. In our case, this is what can be considered as a targeted and a meaningful loss of species according to certain law. For instance, losing the bigger body size animal, the species with more links, and so on and so forth. what this plot is telling us is that in random networks, those indicated by the E with the triangle and the rhomboid, the robustness is identical between the two types of primary extinction, the failure, the random deletion of nodes, and the attack, the targeted attack. So in random networks, there are no differences between types of primary extinction. It doesn't matter how we remove the nodes and or how we're going to lose our species. Instead, in scale-free networks, and likewise in empirical food webs, and we will see later, the way we remove the nodes, that is, the type of primary extinction, significantly influence network robustness. Indeed, network robustness is quite high facing failure. If we look at the blue squares, the fragility of the network is fairly low, so the robustness is fairly high, which means that scale-free networks, likewise food webs, but let's focus in this particular example, they are quite robust against random extinction. So if we just randomly pick up some nodes and we remove them. On the other hand, the network is quite fragile. The robustness is very low against targeted attack. Indeed, as we can see in the red circles, the higher the fraction of nodes that we remove, the steeper it's the loss of species due to the secondary extinction. And this indicates that these type of networks are highly fragile to targeted extinction, and in particular much more than what we would expect by chance or also by a random structure of the network. So food webs are similar to this type of non-random networks in the way that they are quite robust against random loss. On the other hand, they are very fragile to selective removal. On the left side of your display, we have a similar type of plot as we have seen before. On the x-axis, we have the fraction of primary extinction, and on the y-axis, we have the extinction rate as calculated discounting primary extinctions, so reflecting the secondary extinction and then the robustness of the network. Three types of primary extinction were used: a selective non-directed one, as indicated by white circles, a random one with just picking up species by chance, and a selective, a targeted extinction where both prey were addressed. In this case, we can see that again the robustness of the network is quite high against random loss of species, but fairly low against a selective, either directed or non-directed loss of species. On the right side, we have a similar study carried out on a set of 16 food webs. Those 16 food webs are also arranged from top left to bottom right, following an increase in connectance, as indicated in the top right of each subplot. The x-axis in each subplot is the fraction of species removed, that is the rate of primary extinction, and on the y-axis we always have the cumulative secondary extinctions divided over by, again, the number of species. So the ratio of secondary extinctions indicating, again, a measure of robustness. You can see that in each subplot there is this line going from top left to bottom right. This is the one-to-one line where basically primary and secondary extinctions sum up to 1, indicating the collapse of the food web. What we can gather from this plot is that, again, food webs are quite robust against the random extinction of species, as indicated by the plus symbol, but they are significantly fragile. They are significantly losing species much faster, and the food web is going to collapse at a higher rate when species are lost, starting from the most connected to the least connected species, as indicated by the white circles. The second important point of this plot is that robustness increases with increasing the connectance, as it is indicated by the time point at which the dots are intercepting with the line of 1 to 1. In a similar fashion, using the same type of food webs, authors use different types of models that we have studied during the last class, and these include the famous cascade and niche models, but also the generalized cascade and the nested hierarchy. These models were compared to a random network. Then authors use 3 types of primary extinctions, a random one as in the middle, an order following from the most connected to the least connected, and vice versa, a criteria that starts deleting least connected species. Those models were run for networks with an increasing number of species, from 25 in yellow to 200 in blue. The most important point of this graph is that, again, as we can see, the niche model and the generalized cascade model and the nested hierarchy model produce quite similar results. And those are remarkably different from both a cascade model and a random model. In the cascade model, in particular, the robustness was the lowest, while in the random model, the robustness was higher most of the time, regardless of the criteria of species extinction. Yet, in the niche model, we can see that losing species from the most connected to the least connected has an impact on the robustness depending on the number of species. The same can be observed in the other similar models. For simplicity, we can focus just on the niche one, and we can see that with increasing the number of species, we can also increase the robustness. So it's clear that how we decide to lose species is going to have an impact on the robustness. But we want to understand what is going to happen in nature. It's quite likely that species are not going to get randomly extinct. For instance, if we think about defaunation and overfishing, we can hypothesize that species with higher body mass are those going to be lost first. We also know that usually the higher the trophic level, the higher the body mass. That is, species with higher body mass tend to be predators, higher in the food chain. So we can try to understand and generalize the role that trophic level plays in mediating network robustness. In the left side of the display, we have those models where rectangular or triangular food webs were including omnivory or not. The models were generated for an increase in connectance as on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, again, we have the average number of extinction. As we can see, the robustness is the highest for triangular web that include omnivory, while were the lowest for those rectangular webs with or without omnivory. Not only the intercept of the rate of secondary extinction is different, but also the slope, indicating that secondary extinction also varies at a higher rate behind the ground mean. On the right side, we have a similar, the same type of models, but where these trophic levels were divided in basal species, for instance, the phytoplankton, the autotroph organism, the primary producer, in primary consumers and secondary consumers. What we can gather here is a very important result that indicates that losing primary producers, losing basal species, is going to have a tremendous impact on the robustness of the food webs, and particularly much higher than losing primary consumer, or even much higher than secondary consumers. Indeed, losing secondary consumers like top predators is not going to have any significant impact on food web robustness, and in particularly as compared to losing primary producers. This shall indicate that we may want to put more attention on preserving lower trophic level species such as phytoplankton, and rather than focusing on top predators. This can also suggest that stop being top consumers will not have any bad impact on the network. Another way to improve the realism of this robustness model, and as such to help us to make better prediction, is to include the functional traits, the phenotypic traits. You may be familiar with this type of concept, which is basically a trait is any sort of phenotype that we can measure that has also a function in ecological processes, such as body mass, body size. We know that, for instance, there are certain constraints on predator to prey relationship depending on body mass, because these also influence the metabolism. So authors in this nice study, they use as a criteria not a topological criteria. They didn't remove species depending on their fraction on their number of links, on how the species were more or less connected, but they use certain traits such as body mass, and they use these criteria as a targeted, what we call quote-unquote attack. We can see that on the x-axis we have all the different types of models. The random removal of basal species was the one making lower robustness levels. On the other hand, removing species according to body mass, or the more generalist or specialist, had quite an impact on network robustness, and in particularly moving from left to right, we can see how robustness increasing with moving towards species that are going to get primary extinct, that are smaller or least connected, as we learned so far. But we can also take a step back and consider how these models of robustness are carried out, and particularly the assumption that for a primary extinction there is necessary a secondary extinction if the predator is preying only on the primary extinct prey. But this is not always necessarily the case, because predators may also change their behavior and adapt and start feeding on other prey before the population decline completely. This concept is named trophic adaptation, and in jargon this results in what we call interaction rewiring, because there is a possibility that certain species, they change, they rewire the interaction, they rewire their prey. And it has been shown that this trophic adaptability increases substantially the robustness of the food webs. How this is accomplished? On the left, we have a classic food web. So this predator-prey model doesn't usually consider this plausibility of trophic rewiring. Then instead we can build, we already have seen, this type of predator-prey overlap graph, where species are joined by indirected links if they share a common predator, such as species 1, 2, and 3. In panel C, then the authors introduce this so-called rewiring graph. This rewiring graph is obtained from the overlap graph and constrains directed links. A link indicates that, in addition to the shared predators, species 2 has at least one predator that does not prey on species 3. In the rewiring model, following the primary extinction of a species, each of the removed links is considered for rewiring. So, for the remaining prey species, there is a set of potential predators from the closest neighbors in the rewiring graph. A new predator then is selected randomly from this set of potential predators, and the trophic link is rewired accordingly. A new link is drawn. Instead, if there is no potential predators that are available, then the trophic link is removed. Now let's look at D, and let's consider the removal of species 4 from the food web. We can see here on that the prey link of the removed species then can be considered for rewiring. In E, we have the food web after species removal, and then After looking at the rewiring graph that we built previously, a random predator of species 2 that does not prey on species 1 and it is at a higher trophic level, it's selected now. The selection goes, for instance, on species 6, and this is going to be the potential predator for the species 1. In this way, a trophic link, it's rewired, and there is a new connection between species 1 and 6. Finally, in F, we can see that after the removal of the species, also the rewiring graph changing, as a new link is drawn between species 1 and species 3. And this includes the possibility of further rewiring with increasing the fraction of primary species loss. On the right side of your display, the most important message of this plot is that this type of interaction rewiring substantially increases the robustness of the food web, and this is done in all types of food webs, also in the random one, and regardless of the type of primary extinction that we use. So, to conclude this part on network robustness, we have learned that food webs are quite robust against random extinctions. However, it's quite unlikely that species in nature go extinct randomly. Usually, there are some identifiable underlying causes. And this leads us to think that actually a selective removal of species, for instance, due to defaunation and overexploitation, overfishing those high body mass species, is going to have a tremendous impact on food webs, and in particularly they are going to be less robust, they are more fragile than what we would expect just by chance, including traits such as body size or feeding behavior can strongly improve the reality of the models, and in doing so can increase the precision of the predictions. Finally, also considering the adaptive changes like the rewiring, the possibility of predators to change their prey, also increases the network robustness. After this, in the next class, we'll deal with the other external factors that can contribute to network robustness and stability.